because when we were briefly chatting, you talked about having this motivation, which was like rocket fuel that came from your belief, your sets of beliefs. And I just find that really fascinating, because it would be, for me, it would be a different set of beliefs that I'm not normally exposed to.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm just very interested in how people find motivation and fight off nihilism in the modern world.
Yeah. So, okay. That is kind of, I call it rocket fuel, I suppose, because it seems to me that it would be compared to an atheist position. Not that I'm trying to,
Okay.
make fun of or degrade an atheist position, but I'm just like, gosh, I don't know if I would have the right level. Okay, let me share an idea I've been playing with, and it's not super thought out. I haven't gotten to share it much, but I call it, I guess I call it something like the slow degradation. And
Okay.
what I worry about, like for me, there are the mess of desires and passions that I have in my heart. You know, all this crazy stuff that it's like, I want that right now type of stuff.
Yeah.
And I find those things amazingly difficult to control unless I have some sufficient reason to just cut them, to have extremely strong principles that moderate them, like
Okay.
very strong. Like, and the slow degradation, I guess I'll say theory, is that it seems to me that if I didn't have, because to me, God is very, very personal. The first time I felt like I heard God's voice was when my father died at the age of 13. And as we were driving away from the hospital, I thought I heard my dad say, "Take care, Tiger," which was his nickname for me. And then immediately I heard a deeper, more generalized voice say, "I'm your father now."
Okay.
And so I've had experiences of talking with God, and I've had lots of experiences trying to hear from God where he didn't speak, but I wanted him to. And then I've had an experience where I kind of discovered ways to kind of tune in better and moderate the noise, if you will. And so that speaking with God has become much, much more easy. Though it's never easy, it's just easier now. All that to say that makes God very real to me and very personal. And it's much more like a relationship than a religion, if you will. And so because I have this God who is incredibly, to my shock, has been very encouraging. Like when God started encouraging me about 2 years ago, saying, "You're doing fine, man," stuff like that. And that just blew my mind. I was like, what? How can a perfect God say I'm doing okay? That makes no sense to me. So that was the kind of experience I started having in this kind of meditative state, in this state where I'm trying to declutter my mind and get focused in on the divine. And in the midst of that, I found God being almost playful with me, and just fatherly. And it wasn't something I was looking for. It wasn't something I was expecting. So all that to say, that created a whole new level of encouragement and control and motivation. Motivation was the word I was looking for. And so for me, I guess I'll just be very transparent, even though this is a little awkward, and say that I was exposed to pornography when I was like 8 years old. My dad had stacks of it in his bedroom, and I became addicted to it, or at least I call it an addiction, very early. And it was an ongoing source of incredible shame, but also incredible, like, power or I'm trying to think of the right word, elation, transcendence almost. But always accompanied not only by that shame, but by the fact that being in that mindset more and more made actually interacting with women nearly impossible. extremely awkward at the very least, and I was already a very awkward social person. So, and it was only through these interactions with God the Father that I found any relief from that. For instance, I went to college for a degree in art. And one of the things you do in the art classes I was having, at least, is study nude models. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this, God. This is crazy. And one night of praying, God was just like, don't worry about it. I got this. You've got this. It's fine. And this is long before I started having a better tuning in to God. But that was one of the moments where the lines of communication opened up really well, and I heard this from him. And it was true. Throughout my college experience, with a couple of exceptions, pornography completely ceased to be an issue, as did lust. It was amazing. It was freeing. And that didn't come back until my first marriage, which had a lot of problems. It was more of I think we were both in love with the idea of being in love and getting married, but we didn't really know how to love each other. And boy, I'm really going into a lot of my personal.
No, if you want to stop sharing,
no, that's fine.
I love this kind of stuff.
Good.
I live for kind of deep, meaningful. I don't care about the weather. I care about what people feel and how they get value in the world. So.
Yeah. No, that's fine. I just didn't realize I was going to open up this much. But no, that's fine. That's perfect. So my first marriage resulted in all of that addiction kind of flowing back into my soul, if you will, and became this. After she left me, I went through this cycle where I would binge pornography for like almost all night long, literally, and then would spend the next week hating myself, and then I wouldn't be able to resist again. And that's when I started going to SA programs, which is Sexaholics Anonymous. And that wasn't really working. I tried it in Alabama where I was living. And then when I came back home, I started trying a meeting here as well. And it was only giving me some relief. And then I finally went through a program called Wild at Heart by a guy called John Eldridge, who has a ministry called Ransomed Heart. He was a counselor who felt like God was calling him to do a wider ministry instead of just one-on-one counseling. Interesting guy. I don't agree with everything he says, but he certainly got through to me in my capacity to tune into God and gave me the toolkit I needed. And I still get frustrated sometimes listening to him because I'm like, I don't agree with you right there, buddy. But at the same time, it's just like, well, he's got the toolkit to help me. So, that's an important part of it. So yeah. And now I think it has been probably 6 years since I've come close to anything like a binge in pornography. And it has probably been 8 to 10 months since I've even looked at pornography. Before that, there would be like brief moments where I might have a strong desire, open up a web browser and do a quick search and then be like, no, I really don't want this. And then I would meditate and I'd get connected with God and then it would be over. And so there would just be these slight slips of the gear, but I'd get back on board. So that's kind of, the slow, going back to this theory of the slow degradation, what I worry about is if I lost this connection with God the Father, it seems to me that I would start making excuses. Well, can't I manage this? Can't I enjoy a little bit of this? Because it really was like a euphoric experience for me. Like my entire mind seemed to be more consumed. And it was, I'll go ahead and share a slight bit of detail and say that pornography for me was never about creating a fantasy about a person and seducing them. It was more like an abstraction of sexuality. This, it's hard for me to describe. It was very impersonal. It was very almost inhuman in some ways. It was just this like.
Was it an escapism?
Probably. I tend to think it was almost like a drug. It was finding the mix of imagery and such that would trigger the right response within me. Because I would get online, and rather than finding a fantasy to hook into, I would just be like image after image after image, just super, super fast. And the whole time I'd be like, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. But it was all part of it, so to speak. I was trying to find this perfect state and couldn't find it. And so it'd just be like, that's it, that's not it, that's definitely not it, that's not it, that's close, but that's also gross, so that's not it, that kind of thing. Yeah. So it was a torturous experience, but at the same time, it was euphoric. So it was very strange.
So this slow degradation is about the fact that this experience you have with this thing that you call God is it's a very personal relationship,
right? And
it pulls, and I think using other philosophical analogies, it helps the rider on top of the elephant, or it helps the chariot rather than the horses. Like it's about. It helps you gain a feeling of control, and it helps you to basically puncture that kind of guilt complex that arises from when you indulge in that kind of binging and that kind of escapism. And the time when it's really kind of shook you to your core is during quite extreme emotional experiences. So your father dying, for instance, and then that coming in and kind of as a voice. And then further on in your life, when you've been struggling with this sex addiction or this pornography addiction, or however you'd like to define it, you would worry that you would start making excuses without this divine connection. This is the force which kind of gives credence and power to a side of yourself that you feel is much more worthy, or a much better side of yourself.
Right. I think that's pretty clear. I mean, that's kind of the creed I've come most to live by. So, and again, this is something that I think John Eldredge brought most to the foreground for me, even though it's something I've always believed in, which is that, we live, as it were, by the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ Jesus. And the death is not only his death, but my death to my sins and all the things that are wrong with me. And then I resurrect with him and receive a new heart and a new mind from him, a new spirit, if you will, a new character. And then with the ascension, things get a little weird, but it's about authority over the forces of evil that seem to be coming against me. So that in the first category of putting what's in me to death, that's about the parts of me that are out of alignment with God. My sexuality being all wired the wrong way, if you will. And it's saying, no, I'm dead to that habit of behavior, but I'm alive to this new habit. And it is about finding a force stronger than those forces. That's what kind of AA and SA and such are about, is finding a higher power. So it's about finding this higher power and knowing that it is truer than those bad habits. And then the last category of authority is about the sensation I have sometimes that there are external, and I'm not trying to make a metaphysical claim necessarily, although I tend to believe there's something metaphysical going on when I'm describing these things. I don't require certainty of it, nor to make it certain to others. So the demonic would be this idea of spirits who are like, okay, I'm going to, this part of his flesh, his habits are not active, but I'm going to try to make it happen. I'm gonna get in there and tempt him, if you will. And then when I feel like there's something external coming against me, then I have the authority to say, spirit of, and I try to find out what its name is, because, like, why am I feeling this way? What's going on? Why? I don't understand. And then I start having kind of this kind of analysis and discussion, kind of inner discussion, and even discussion with the spirit, which I can dialogue with, which I'm fine saying that is perhaps something like, there's a psychologist that has a book called Family, what is it called? something like inner family dialogues or something like that. And the idea is that we are kind of an inner family of beings, of personalities that
Like
have a
Inside
relationship
Out.
with each other. What's that?
Like Inside Out, the Disney film.
Kind of, yeah. Only it's more like, instead of your emotions, it's more like the protector. And I think one of the common ones is the fireman, meaning he goes around putting out fires. And so there's these different parts of your personality that you can actually have a dialogue with and find out things that you wouldn't have found out about yourself without that dialogue. So it's very possible that these demons that I'm interacting with are kind of like that. They're just personifications of my own personality, but they come at me in a different way than habit and desire does. They come at me in a more personable way, almost, even though that sounds strange to call a demon personable. And so, yeah, go ahead.
So, like, these demons or these fires, or however you want to describe these urges, do they, in your head, do they manifest as something from something supernatural? Let's say, I don't know whether you define it as kind of a devil or something from outside, or do you think they come from purely naturalistic explanations, like the human condition and biology and environment?
So I'm probably sounding very confusing because I'm saying I'm not making a claim whether they are in my head or external spiritual forces. I act as if, to use Jordan Peterson's terms, they are actual spirits, because that seems to be the more useful way to interact with them. It seems to be the truer way.
Truth, or I can't remember the term he uses.
Oh, well, what I'm referring to is the fact that he will say, for instance, I act as if God exists. I don't know that he exists, but I act as if. So in the same vein, I would say something like, I cannot prove to you or anyone else that there are actual spirits who are trying to tempt me and darken my path towards God, but I act as if they are there because there is tremendous utility in doing so. If I merely believed it was a part of my brain, I might not take them as seriously. I might just be like, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's just a part of my brain. I can, I don't have to really do this.
If we could find out what those underlying principles were through just a purely naturalistic framework, so a scientific understanding of the brain, and that helped developed methods which were based on empirical evidence. So the fact that certain parts of your brain fire and certain experiences cause a certain amount of trauma, which blah, 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 blah. And then we could develop tools in which to help those particular feelings, which weren't based on a supernatural explanation. Would you still want to have that supernatural explanation? Would you still want to have that metaphorical truth or that belief that they were from a supernatural origin or an origin that could or might not would you care either way, I suppose, is trying to get
right. Would I care either way is probably the more to the point issue here, because for one thing, it's not at all clear to me, epistemologically speaking, that science can ever prove things like, are there spirits or not? Is there a God or not? It just doesn't seem to be the right purview. Science appears to be about, this measurement of data, this finding a standardization that we can measure things by, and that measurement does not change, of course. But what does appear to change throughout the history of science is how we interpret that data. I can reproduce an experiment from 100 years ago, and it'll still work, but that experiment might be completely debunked as trying to prove what it was intended to prove at the time, because we have a deeper understanding of things. And so my position is, sure, even if God were to appear before humanity as a whole, it's not obvious to me that everyone would be able to or would want to, even more to the point, consider that evidence. I'm not sure we are the kind of beings that will see a God if we're not wanting to see a God and be like, oh, yeah, okay, I'm convinced now because there he is.
Have you heard of? I don't know. There's a wonderful. It's like a small little parable by David Foster Wallace in his kind of commencement speech. This is Walter. I don't know whether you heard it before. And it picks up exactly the same point that you were getting at, is whether people would actually want to believe it, even if it's in the face. And he says that there are two men who've just come in from outside, and it's in Alaska, and it's been snowing all the time. And one guy's just come in, he's just survived a storm, and he goes, "Oh my God, it must be a miracle that you survived the storm." And he goes, "No, it wasn't a miracle. What happened was that just a bunch of Eskimos came by at the right minute and managed to pick me up and take me here." And so there's just two different interpretations about what counts as a miracle act and what counts as kind of a naturalistic death.
It's not a miracle that they just happened to show up.
Yeah. And I suppose it sounds to me, because a lot of what you're saying, like, I would agree on the principles themselves, but not on their definitions. So
sure. Yeah.
I see where, obviously I'm not you, so I don't know that personal experience. But when you describe kind of these urges and these pushes and pulls, I describe them in a slightly different way, but they still exist for me. And just like those tools in which, I sit down and understand what's going on here, I'd have a dialogue with that. There's parts of me that want to put out fires, and parts of me that want to start fires. Like, I would explain that all within a naturalistic framework, and the tools in which to use in order to give power to the chariot and not to the horses or the rider rather than the elephant, for me, can come purely from a naturalistic framework. And I wouldn't use supernatural terminology, let's say, that Jordan Peterson does. That's not to say that it isn't useful, but I found it incredibly fascinating that that's the way that you couch it. And I'm wondering, why do you describe it as God? Why is there not another word associated with it? And maybe that's there's so much there that it's not the right question. But
no, I think, well, I mean, basically, I call it God because that's what people call it. I mean, I don't know what else to call it. I mean, I've known Christians who will not use the term God, but will say like Yahweh or Jehovah or something like that. And I'm like, man, I don't have any need to feel like I have the special name for God down pat and figured out. And so to me, it's all about, this is the being who embodies the highest principles that there can be. And so that sounds like God to me.
What do you think about the outsider test? Do you think that this would manifest with using different supernatural language if you were born in a different culture and raised differently?
Good question. I have no idea. But I speculate. See, this is, I'm so biased by my own beliefs, obviously, that I don't know if I can properly answer this question. Because to me, if I consider myself growing up in another culture, I perceive that version of me feeling as if the religion I was growing up with was lacking something. I've even felt that of my own religion until I found a deeper understanding of my religion. I was the kid that was always questioning everybody and going, why? Like while fully participating in my Christianity, I was always like, this doesn't make sense, that kind of thing, and challenging people. And at the time, I was actually backing into something like a hardcore fundamentalism because, my parents divorced when I was 5 years old. I was always the outsider in school. We moved around a lot. And my dad died at 13. So I wanted stability, dang it. I wanted to know what was strong and stable and I could depend on. And it wasn't until really after reflecting on my experiences of college. So I went through college pretty much being the fairly conservative Christian and a fundamentalist Christian. And on the other side of that, having had many parts of my fundamentalism taken apart, primarily a young earth creationism, but other things as well, I finally was like, okay, I don't need this fundamentalism. Not only do I not need this fundamentalism, but it actually is getting in the way of my relationship with God, because basically it was a attempt in me to be certain of how to approach God, whereas my faith now is a absolute trust in God's capacity to reach me. So it's a reversal of directions. The fundamentalism was me saying, I know how to get to God. And what I do now is I say, God, I know can get to me. So yeah,
it
go ahead.
sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, it sounds like the fundamentalism was part of you providing yourself with a structure to cope with a lack of moorings.
Right.
The fact that you didn't feel anchored, and therefore you're pushing yourself into a hard fundamentalist position so that you could feel the certainty that you so craved.
Right.
Is that fair assessment?
I think that's very fair. Yeah.
And then after that, you realize that that wasn't as necessary to have that fundamentalism, and you started to value the truth of the matter, kind of a naturalistic framework of much more than the feeling side of the matter, but you still kept it for you. It's still the truth of the matter, this metaphorical and important truth of having those structures exist.
Yeah, I think that. So to be clear, number one, it wasn't simply that I didn't need the fundamentalism, but that the fundamentalism was actually getting in the way.
Okay.
And number two, the fundamentalism was a method of interpreting my experience of God. So it was kind of the lens I was trying to see God through.
Okay.
And what I discovered is that lens was reflecting me too much, if you will.
Okay.
You know, it's almost like there was a mirrored lens, and I was focusing too much on me through my fundamentalism. And when I removed that, and I stopped focusing so much on my behavior and who I am and started trusting God more, it was like I had a clearer lens. And that clearer lens, for instance, what it means biblically was that I no longer required the Bible to be a collection of absolute statements that I had to believe, but it became something more metaphorical. It could be almost anything, so long as I was willing to say somehow this statement is true, and I have to be open to the truth of the statement that's coming through, not what it must be, what I can establish and prove and be certain of, but you know, I can't be certain of it. But what is God speaking to me through this statement, and what have other people found God saying to them?
You gauge whether to accept. So your belief system is based on how useful it is to you. So it's in terms of. So it's all about how the interpretation affects your experience in terms of providing you with this security and this ability to slow down this slow degradation and to fight back against those urges. It's about the usefulness of it.
I think that's fairly accurate. Usefulness. I have
maybe it's a bit ugly because usefulness doesn't have any of those connotations of the divine or the kind of types of experience you're talking about.
Well, sure, and I've had, like, Sean Carroll has been using that in his book. Did I get the name right? I think I did.
Yeah, I think so.
He was using usefulness, and I was just like, what do you mean by useful? What is this supposed to mean? And I've heard other people say that, and it really struck me wrong. And I finally found his definition of it on chapter 48, and I'm like, oh my gosh, you waited until chapter 48 to talk about this? And it's like it was something like useful in making predictions, and I was like, oh, no wonder I don't feel right about this term. But
I think there are two things there. There's the truth of the matter, so what is actually going on, and whether that truth is useful at all. We could have truths that could destroy humanity.
Exactly.
Or we could learn about things that fundamentally switch us in a way that is bad. And then there are useful, and then there are useful truths which help us. And then I see in a different category kind of these metaphorical truths, which may not necessarily be the case. So there may not be a God that exists, but pretending that a God exists helps provide a useful framework in which to live a good life,
Right.
however you want to define living a good life.
That's pretty close. So the epistemology I've been developing has three categories. It has conceptually consistent, meaning there's no glaring inconsistencies in your conceptual models. There's externally consistent, meaning your concepts actually align with what you can observe, and there's no glaring inconsistencies there. But then the final category, which those two you could describe science as trying to aim at, but the third category is livability, is what I call it. And it's the idea of, can I live this way?
Yeah.
Is it consistent? Like, will it actually work for me? Will it actually produce the effects it says it will? Like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Are those actually coming alive in me when I try to live this Christian life or not? So, I mean, you could call that useful, but I like livable because it seems to speak to the root of the issue. It's not that I'm merely getting use out of it. It's that it actually helps me live my life.
I think that for me, that's the fundamentals of it. Yeah, everything should be based around that. Like, we learn about truths in order for them to track back to the values of living a good life.
Yes.
Like, we wouldn't conduct science if it didn't provide, if it caused horrible pain for everyone, we would never do science. So
right.
It all goes back to that fundamental root of usefulness. And for me, I suppose, so there's something here, I'm interested. Do you think, it sounds like you do, but I don't want to make this assumption. So I'm just kind of bouncing it off you. It sounds like you think that from an atheist or agnostic perspective, actually, the tools that we have, the heuristics that we could have to slow that degradation down, to give power to the rider rather than the elephant, is not as powerful as a more religious framework in which brings in the concepts of God. And you actually think that if a society, well, I'm just now speculating completely here, but if a society was to wrench out that those religious connotations and concentrate on, and again, define these how you want, and then concentrate on a purely kind of secular perspective on living a good life, that they would be lacking something fundamental. In fact, the life wouldn't be worth living as much as a life which has this kind of divine aspect to it.
Okay. Let's imagine a Venn diagram real quick.
Okay.
3 interlocking circles. One of those circles is religion.
Yeah.
One of those circles, I'm going to go ahead and call it secular humanism. And I am going to claim that there are ways in which secular humanism can overlap religion. I think John Vervaeke is, trying to make that happen, that kind of thing. And then the third category, the third circle, is what I'm going to say a relationship with the divine, whatever divine means for you. So the point of these three, this diagram, is that I think there are ways in which religion gives people the tools they need to have a relationship with the divine, and there are ways that it fails to. Same with secular humanism. The sweet spot is whatever way you use to get there, get into that relationship with the divine. Like, that's the sweet spot. That's the spot that is actually functioning.
Yeah.
So that's the way I see it. Does that answer your question?
I think so. You know what? We're so similar. We just use a different language. It's amazing when you realize.
No, I find that extremely common, and I think it's because, I don't know. We live in interesting times. I think the internet has allowed these kind of people who are trying to put their thoughts together in a way that resonates most clearly to themselves, are able to finally find each other and compare notes through the internet. And so this has probably been happening throughout history. There's these individual sages that are just walking around going, it's got to be like this, because I don't see how that works that society has always given me. And we're finally able to corroborate our ideas and start to share them, and hopefully maybe even start to codify them in a way that everyone can take advantage of.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, and that's for me. So, like, I'm a secular humanist. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, I want to become a humanist chaplain. Like, that's one of the things in
Nice,
my.
very cool.
And so, for me, all these values that you have, I also share too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I also worry that if we don't get this language right and we don't connect with what people really need, that we'll end up with basically a stripped down society in which there's a lot of pain and
Mm.
very little tools to deal and process that
Yeah,
particular pain. And I think life is full of suffering and pain, and so it's what's really necessary is that we have these good tools, and that it's an open dialogue, and that we have these discussions, and we have places where people can go and experience the divine, however you want to couch
right.
that, but also to be able to punch at what we've got. So much surface level talk, and sometimes what's really necessary is that we can discuss those things, these massive yearnings within the kind of being a human, and being able to think about how to face them. And
Mm-hmm.
and however, for me, I'm open to however people want to look at that, but I place a much larger emphasis on getting the truth right, and
Mm-hmm.
from the truth I think that the more useful thing will come about, the more useful tools will come about.
Mm-hmm.
But I could be wrong with that. It
Sure.
could be Peterson's interpretation of, actually, look, that's not how you get at these answers. Obviously that could be the case.
Well, I tend to think that there is much to be said for the role of personality in all of this. Again, I could be wrong about that, but it seems to me that there are people that have dispositions towards different interpretive grids or paradigms of the world. And for me, to be clear, I really do think there's a God. I use a lot of secular language. I've tried to, for the past 10 years especially, but even before that, I've tried to look at secular atheism, secular humanism, because there's things about it that I think are right, and be like, okay, how can I adapt my Christianity into this? How can I build a bridge between these two things? That's been a big part of my project.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I have a lot of language that makes me sound like a secular humanist instead of someone who actually believes in God. But I really think he's up there or out there.
Yeah.
That creates interesting tensions. For instance, I struggle a lot with hell, and I've struggled with homosexuality, the idea of judging the homosexual. Once I understood, once I was out of my conservative bubble that just assumed it was about lust, and discovered that there are people that are like, I don't know how to be interested in a woman at all, but I'm in love with this person, and then why should I be judged for that? Once I found that argument compelling, I was like, well, crap. How does this work with the Bible?
That's a whole different.
Oh, I know, right? That could be a series.
It could be a play series. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to hammer the nail in a half an hour conversation. What's
Sure.
taken religious scholars thousands of years.
I was only bringing it up as an example of how my perspective is, and oh shoot, I lost my track of thought because I jumped from one thing, and I wanted to be clear that I actually am a believer. Not just how do I say it? Not pretend, but act as if. Like I use the language "act as if," but I think he's really there. I just don't have a methodology of proving that I'm absolute certainty of it.
Is it okay if we leave that there, Matthew? Because that's a lot for me to digest.
Okay.
And,
sure.
I'm happy to have a second follow-up conversation.
That would be great. I was gonna at some point I was gonna be like, you haven't hit me with anything hard yet, so I'm fine with you hitting me with something hard. By the way,
I'd much rather have a discussion than try and hold your beliefs over a hot flame, I have to say. But there's plenty of, and maybe that fire will get ignited because I want to hammer home a point more than
yeah. Well, how do I say this? There's, so long as it's done cordially, I find that interesting. It's when somebody is really trying to push my emotional buttons that I find myself unable to respond honestly.
Yeah, well, it's
and
ugly.
That's problematic. Yeah, it just gets ugly. I have, that's, we've talked about Sam Harris before. I have a hard time responding honestly with Sam Harris because I find he pushes all my emotional buttons. And that's frustrating because I find him to be a genius guy. I find him to be insightful, but that there is this emotional barrier to get to him sometimes. It's just like, why did you put that in my way? Come on, Sam. Can we go around this barrier of emotional load? So anyway,
Yeah.
sure,
Well,
we can finish here. Look,
I'll see you at book club if you're doing book
yeah,
club.
yeah. I hope to be there.
All
Thank
right.
you for this. This was a good time.
Yeah. Speak later. Bye.
Yep. Bye.